there's a protein that aggregates that's associated with Parkinson's called alpha-synuclein, and they have shown that it starts in the gut and travels up the vagus nerve to the brain. And they've even shown if
All right, y'all, I'm here with Martha. Thank you so much for joining us today, Martha.
thank you for having me, Hope. I'm excited to be here.
Me too. Okay, so and everybody listening already knows, I love a good conversation about the gut-brain connection. So I'm excited about this conversation. I I love how you got into this field though. And so you originally got into kind of like doing your own research and stuff through your husband's diagnosis with Parkinson's. So can you tell us a little bit about how all that went down and you kind of taking it upon yourself to dive into this world and like what big revelations you had with your research through this and your husband's diagnosis?
Sure. So actually, John was diagnosed when he was really young. He was 44,
Oh,
and that was back
wow.
in 2002. And he was a healthy, supposedly, or he looked healthy on the outside,
Mhm.
marathon running,
Wow.
athlete his whole life.
Yeah,
And um, you go to the neurologist and they give you a pill and kind of say there's nothing they can
sure.
do. It's just a long, slow
Hmm.
slide down.
Yep.
And that just didn't make any sense to me. My background was in business turnarounds and business operations. And I was like, why can't we just approach this like a business turnaround and figure out what's going on
Right.
that way? And so I just came home and got out the books and started digging in and looking at it like I looked at a business, like what's flowing through the
Hmm.
business. Well, flowing through the body is
Sure.
food and water. So I started there and started really trying to figure out how to clean up the diet. And back then there wasn't a lot of organic food. So I started studying, okay, what's the food supply we have? Like, how are we growing it? I hadn't paid any attention to genetically engineering or like how that was done or what that did to the food. And so I started to educate myself that way. So over the course from 2002 to 2014, so 12 years, pretty long time,
Yeah.
studying all these different pieces of that and gradually moving deeper into studying the complexity of Parkinson's, like reading deep science papers and then going back and kind of teaching myself the chemistry and biochemistry and all the things I needed to be able to understand and read those research papers. And in 2014, I read a book by Dr. Martin Blazer called Missing Microbes. And he was talking about our generation. I mean, I'm older than you are,
Hmm.
of growing up, but of course you have too now, growing up in the age of antibiotics
Yeah.
and how that was correlated with the rise in all these chronic
Mhm.
diseases, this exposure. And he used the term microbiome, which I had never heard. And I was like, what's this microbiome? I think
Hmm.
this is important because I also knew that many people with Parkinson's that I had spoken with over the years had had repeated strep infections. And so
Interesting.
they had taken a lot of courses of
Antibiotics.
antibiotics.
Hmm.
So fast forward about 6 months later, the first paper was published that showed they could divide. Parkinson's has two primary types. The one most people are familiar with is people having a tremor or a
Right.
shaky or something. And the other one is called posture and gait. And that is where with the bent over sort of
Mm.
penguin like posture
Yep.
and freezing gait. And he published a paper showing you could divide those two different phenotypes by the gut bacteria.
Oh,
And I was like,
wow. Oh, that's
that,
crazy.
yeah, I was like, that's it.
Yeah.
Coming from my accounting background, I was like, this gut microbiome is the general ledger. So I quit my job and started funding research at the University of Chicago, where I met one of my co-founders, Jack Gilbert, and then about that same time met another researcher who had worked at the CDC for 17 years studying chronic fatigue. And we were talking about these common elements across, we call something a single disease and we look at it that way, but really there were these shared loss of function in the microbiome. And we came up with this idea of, how would we accelerate the discovery by building a biobank? And so I just kind of got a wild hair and started a company to start collecting people's stool samples and making those available to scientists. And so from 2015 to now, so 9 years later, that has morphed from primarily a research focused platform for other scientists into we actually make products. We make probiotics to restore lost function. We've made computational models to understand what's going on in the microbiome and to put teams of microbes together. We've also, expanded. We have an investment in a small agriculture company to deal with the problems in the soil the same way by building those teams. And we've isolated and built our own bank of probiotic organisms. So kind of a long journey, but from being an accountant and business person to applying that way of thinking and those skills into looking at the microbiome and trying to solve problems inside the body like I used to do inside of companies.
Yeah, I love that approach. Like I would have never put those two together as like this. That I love that approach. That's like, okay, we just need to figure out what. That's so practical. Like I feel like it's so practical and pragmatic. Like why are we not looking at our health in that same way in other areas? I love that. Okay, so when you're looking at, and I also want to say, I'm going to be honest, I did not know. I mean, I've never done extensive research on Parkinson's. I did not know there was two types. I thought the tremors and all the other symptoms, I thought all of that went together. So I also, and that's fascinating that you could separate it by the gut microbiome. That's crazy.
Yeah, it's actually in some places they kind of call it a designer disease
Mm.
because there's like all these different non-motor symptoms and when I started studying the microbiome, when we started sequencing our samples and I'm getting this list of all these different microbes, I started first because I didn't know what any of these microbe names were. So I would start looking in the literature for papers about them. And a lot of what was written was basically if you had an infection with this microbe, this would be sort of the acute symptoms. And when I started looking at it, I was like, well, you could just look in people's microbiomes and figure out if they have, low grade this, or this, that they've got kind of a subacute infection. And
Mm.
so that really started my thinking about Parkinson's and really other things too, being chronic polymicrobial infections that
Mhm.
sort of layer on all these different
Sure.
symptoms because your immune system isn't able to kick them out.
Right. Right. Yeah, for sure. No, that makes total sense. When you started kind of implementing some of these things with your husband and his diagnosis, what did you find were some of the things that made the biggest impact on, I'm assuming it helped with like, stave off symptoms and kind of, prolong the
Right.
downfall or whatever. So what did you find in terms of like restoring, you mentioned restoring function to the gut microbiome. What were the things that made the biggest difference?
So, well, initially, really throwing out all the processed foods.
Mm.
And, one of the things that he had been doing for the 2 years prior to his diagnosis was drinking a soy protein shake every day. And,
Hmm.
it came from, some MLM
Sure.
company. We had no idea what the source of the soy was. And so
Sure.
that really put me deep into understanding these proteins and soy in particular and how soy was grown, which really got me into understanding the organophosphates and
Yep.
glyphosate,
Yep.
how that was so widely used.
Yep.
So really shifting that and moving away from the processed foods and the high carbohydrate, which also as a marathon runner and he was also a cyclist,
Hmm.
they they carb load
Sure. Yeah.
they drink just terrible, Gatorade
Yeah.
or You know,
The
those goo
goos.
packs
Yes, yes.
of
Uh-huh.
like fructose, and
Yep. Yep.
it's terrible, terrible
Hmm.
stuff that they do when they're doing a race or something like that. And so
Yeah.
really moving him off that was a big, a big mover. And we played around with different fibers and a lot. He used to joke and say, "Oh no, she's on the no fun diet number 20 or so," because I would learn something new
Yeah,
and we would try something different. He's
sure.
probably has more gut microbiome sequences than I think we have like 165 of his samples.
Oh my
And,
gosh.
very few people on the planet have that many
Yeah.
sample sequences. But that's sort of how we learned what different impacts were, and also, learned occasionally like what, even no matter what you did, you couldn't move this one particular microbe that was a pathogen that was kind of troubling for us.
Interesting. Interesting. So when we're looking at the connection between the gut and the brain, what is the biggest impact? Like, what is the biggest impact on the brain from the gut microbiome?
Well, I would say it's the stress hormones.
Mm,
So, and stress hormones, I think people don't really appreciate. So Parkinson's is there's quite a bit of research showing that it's people are in a constant state of flight or flight. So they can't switch back and forth from
right.
sympathetic to parasympathetic.
Hmm.
And I've recently been listening to a doctor talking about how each time you have a stressor, whether that's a physical stressor, you hit your head,
Sure.
or, even a long distance running event like a
Yeah.
marathon would be
Yeah.
an
It's a
extreme
big stress.
stressor,
Yeah.
or an emotional stressor, that each time you do that, it affects the brain's ability to absorb glucose.
Mm,
And Parkinson's and Alzheimer's both have been uh, papers calling them type 3 diabetes, where the
diabetes, right?
insulin resistance in the brain.
Mhm.
I think it's actually the glucose can't get across to the brain.
The
But
blood-brain
what
barrier.
you
Yeah.
have is this loop. There's something called microbial endocrinology, which is a field that was developed by Dr. Mark Light, and John Cryan and Ted Dinan kind of have taken that forward. They have a book called Psychobiotic Revolution. And it really talks about this loop because microbes make a lot of hormones and neurotransmitters in our gut,
Right.
serotonin being one of those. But so when you get a stress chemistry in your brain from something, you also feed those same microbes that create more desire for that same chemistry. And so
Mm,
you get this vicious cycle
cycle.
of
Mhm.
this stress hormones, if you
Right.
will, and
Right.
an inability to rebalance that. They've also shown there's a protein that aggregates that's associated with Parkinson's called alpha-synuclein, and they have shown that it starts in the gut and travels up the vagus nerve to the
Mhm.
brain. And they've
Mhm.
even shown, if in people who had in the 1950s who had something called a vagotomy, where they cut the vagus nerve, that they actually had lower incidence of Parkinson's
Holy
because
cow.
it wasn't moving up the vagus
Oh,
nerve
that's
to the brain.
crazy. Wow, that's fascinating. So with the instance you're talking about where it's affecting the neurotransmitters, what do we do to help remedy that?
So, I mean, a lot of what I have a Parkinson's blog called Martha's Quest, where I write about kind of other things people can do. And one of the things actually was Qigong. So John
Hmm.
did a lot of Qigong because it just has a calming effect to it.
Yeah.
It's a very slow moving, kind of subtle. It's also getting the energy flowing in the body. So that was a kind of an interesting, simple technique. I mean, exercise helped also. He
Mm-hmm.
was very instrumental in getting biking programs set up all over the country. They showed that cycling for 1 hour, 3 times a week at 80 to 90 RPMs could actually reduce the symptoms by 35%.
Oh,
So,
wow.
there's an exercise chemistry,
Sure.
but I think there's more to it than just that chemistry.
Hmm.
But also, I would say a lot of that was done in groups.
Yeah.
So there's a relationship and camaraderie that you get. So a lot of the, group events and things that he was involved in also kind of help settle down the
Yeah.
stress and nervous
Yeah.
system. Got that interconnection.
Socialization. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. That's a huge one. I think we underestimate that piece, just to speak on that piece specifically. I had a guy, or I think this made the beginning of this year, a podcast talking about, mental health and socialization and that piece of it. And I really do think we underestimate that piece. I think a lot of us are more aware since COVID and the pandemic when all of us were, quarantined and we saw there was kind of this mental health crisis that happened, on the other side of that. But I really do think we underestimate how much that affects our overall well-being, just being able to have community and social interaction and relationships. Like, I mean, I think that's a big piece.
It's huge. And this computer, the phone, like
Right.
all of the things have pushed us further and further away from that
Exactly.
real direct
Yeah.
connection. So,
Yeah.
it's a big piece of
It
it.
is. It is a big piece. Yeah. The other thing you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the farming piece, and that's like another kind of arm of your company. So what can I want you to talk a little bit about that, what that has to do with this whole conversation about the gut-brain connection, the gut microbiome.
Well, because we use so many chemicals on our food, and many of those are antibiotic or neurotoxic, um, those residues are still on those foods when they come to
Mhm.
us. And, we haven't had a system in place where those things are tested for. I mean, I took a very keen interest in organophosphates. Those came out of the nerve gases that were used in World War II. And,
Yes.
glyphosate is the most widely used organophosphate. It breaks something called the shikimate pathway, which is a technical name for a pathway where lots of different enzymes and secondary metabolites. So about 8,900 enzymes and metabolites are made in that pathway.
Hmm.
And we don't, the three amino acids, tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine, are made in that pathway. We don't make those amino acids, so they call them non-essential,
Right.
but they really are essential. Like
Right.
we can't live without them. We get
Right.
them from food.
Hmm.
So they're either made in the plants in the shikimate pathway, which is where all the polyphenols come out of that
Hmm. Hmm. The good
pathway,
stuff in the plants.
all
Hmm.
the good stuff in the plants.
Hmm.
And the microbes make all of these, amino acids in the secondary metabolites from those. And dopamine is in that pathway also, which is implicated in Parkinson's.
Yep.
And when you break that pathway, so it's patented as an antibiotic, it's broken at the very top. So all the things downstream of that don't get properly made, either in the plant or you kill the microbes in the microbiome that make those things.
Right.
And so all these really critical things that we need, we're not able to make very well anymore because there's so much of that in our food supply. And so that was really one of the hyper vigilant things that I was focused on, was
Yeah.
making sure as much as possible that we weren't eating food that had glyphosate residues. But over the course of the 23 years that John had Parkinson's, that became increasingly difficult because there are now over 60 crops that use it at the end of harvest
That's
to
crazy.
dry the crop. And
Hmm.
so things like lentils and chickpeas and like all your beans and legumes, all your grains, which is, I think, a big contributor to why so many people have trouble with grains.
Sure. For sure. I agree.
the
It's not the grain
herbicide.
itself, it's the chemicals on it. Yeah.
Right. And
Hmm.
then what's resistant to glyphosate is actually like fusarium and some of the fungal pathogens
Uh-huh.
and produce mycotoxins. So then
Mm,
we get, not only do we get the glyphosate problem, but we get a mycotoxin load on top of it. So we're just kind of exacerbating the issue. So, my chief scientific officer, Dr. Raul Kano, was a pioneer of cleaning up oil spills with microbes when he was at Cal Poly. And so, we sat down and we said, okay, well, we're kind of pushing a string up a hill,
mm,
trying to solve our internal problem if we can't simultaneously solve the problem outside.
right.
Because like people think, okay, what we do out there is out there, but it's
Yep.
not out there. It's also in here
Mm,
because, we keep putting it in here.
right.
So we actually came up with a formula that could break down hydrocarbons and organophosphates in the soil and restore the soil microbiome health.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and so we've done about 5 years of testing on all different crops, from wine and grapes to cotton to soy to corn and
Hmm.
cabbage and you name it. We've uh,
Yeah.
done that. We can move the glyphosate out of the soil very quickly and also reduce it in the crop itself.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's crazy. So for those who are listening, can you, and some people might already know the answer, but to those who don't, what is the best way to find products that don't have glyphosate? Like, what are we looking for?
So organic is your best bet, but even that is not 100% foolproof because conventional manure is used on organic,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that can have glyphosate in it.
Yeah.
Um, I actually think sometimes a local farmer at a farmer's market, even though he may not be certified
Sure.
organic, you can actually talk to that person.
Yeah.
You can ask him or her, what do you use on your
Right.
crop?
Right.
And if you are using chemicals, when do you use them?
Right.
Because like sometimes, they might use a small amount at the very beginning,
Hmm.
and you're now 8 to 12 weeks down the road and they haven't used anything.
Yeah.
But at least you can directly ask them, or sometimes you can even go visit them. That
Yeah.
and I just generally tell people it's better to eat local
Right.
because food is information, and it's information about the environment you're living in. And
Hmm.
so if you're getting all your food from South America and California and you live in New York, you're confusing your body with
Yeah.
information from
Right.
somewhere.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great point. That's a great point. Well, I think it's also a great point too about the farmers market because it's expensive for them to get that certified organic seal thing, whatever. So a lot of them do grow, organic and they just don't have the whatever certification thing. So that is a good point to
You can
make.
also, Weston Price Foundation they have some resources for finding farmers. And
Mm,
uh, I'm trying to think of it. It might even be called Find a Farmer. There's a
okay.
website. If you Google, you can find local farm
Yeah.
resources, or even like co-ops where they're all bringing
Yep.
their stuff
Yep.
in together. And this time of year, it's not as easy because a lot of the farmers markets are shut down. But
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Unless you're in South Texas and it's summer all year long. That's where we are.
yes.
But yeah. Okay, so as we kind of start to wrap up this conversation, I want you if you have like three main like most important things you'd want to tell people of like when we're talking about like keeping a balanced microbiome or even restoring function, what are the three most important things people should be doing?
Well, so one of the kind of early findings, we were looking at what's going on in the gut and what loss of function was, and it came actually out of a Parkinson study that was showing that the sugar alcohol mannitol could stop the aggregations of the proteins in Parkinson's. And so I
Interesting.
came back and was studying mannitol chemistry. Well, there's microbes and they're key, like lactobacillus, bifidobacteria, and some soil-based microbes that help convert sugars in the gut.
Mm-hmm.
And so we made this test probiotic for John, but ultimately we went on and did a clinical trial in a diabetes cohort. And the big aha out of that was 100% of the people who took the product in our double-blind clinical trial had a reduction in something called serum endotoxin. And so when you have imbalance in your gut microbiome, endotoxin comes from gram-negative bacteria, which is a lot of the more pathogenic organisms that when you have a dysbiotic gut, you may be tipped over in that direction.
Right.
And their cell walls, when they grow and die, produce this endotoxin. And that endotoxin is highly inflammatory. And if you have a leaky gut, which if you have dysbiosis, you likely have a leaky gut. Marathon runners, every time they do those endurance athletic events, that barrier opens up and endotoxin crosses over. And so this inflammatory endotoxin, there are animal models for Parkinson's, MS, diabetes, depression. If you get too much endotoxin, that's how people die of sepsis.
Right.
So our sugar shift probiotic, which is our best seller and the one I originally made for John, actually lowered that endotoxin significantly and in every subject. And so, like, I think that's an underappreciated thing. We also have a publication coming out about it because a lot of the microbiome papers talk about this ratio of what are called Bacteroides to Firmicutes.
Right.
It's but that really doesn't tell you a whole lot. And what our research indicated is it's really an imbalance between microbes that are oxygen tolerant and anaerobic, because you want your gut to be anaerobic. So when you get sort of tip the balance over, and a lot of those endotoxin producing bacteria are what are called facultative anaerobes, so they can tolerate oxygen. So when you tip that over, you get that imbalance. And so that's something, we want to really start to talk about, people starting to look at and understand the balance of oxygen loving versus anaerobic bacteria in the gut, and the importance of maintaining that balance.
That's fascinating. And the probiotic that you developed does that part.
Yes, does that part.
Yeah, that's
Shifts
awesome.
back the gut to an anaerobic environment, and then that allows things like the bifidobacteria, which is an anaerobe, to grow again. And that bifidobacteria is actually the species of bifidobacteria is something that we are losing as a population. Our babies have lost bifido infantis from generations of not breastfeeding, and just generally the way we live. And in COVID, and also in Parkinson's, but in COVID, the people who had the worst outcomes had lower bifidobacteria. Parkinson's also had lower bifidobacteria. There's some new research coming out that bifidobacteria make something called plasmalogens that are really healthy for the brain. They're very important for the brain. And there's a Dr. Dayan Goodnow who's actually developing programs restoring brain health focused on plasmalogens. So making sure that we're supporting our bifidobacteria in our gut is very important.
Yeah, that's such a good tip. So there you go. Go look for the bifidobacteria. We want that. I love it. And the probiotics, of course, I'll have the links to all of that, everything that Martha's talking about. There's links in the show notes so you can check out her probiotics. This is so fast. I mean, I could geek out on the science stuff all day. So I love that you're showing all this science stuff, but it's also very practical. It's like we've talked about glyphosate and food and processed food and these specific types of bacteria that we need. So this is all so practical and helpful. I love this so much. Before I have one more question I want to ask you that I like to ask everybody at the end. But do you have anything else, any last advice or whatever that you want to leave for the listeners that about the gut microbiome?
Well, you are actually more microbial than you are human. And I think most people don't realize that. So in a ratio of cells to, human cells to microbial cells, it's something like 2 to 1. But
Wow.
in terms of gene functions, it's like 200 to 300 times more genes in our gut in the microbes
Crazy.
in and on our body than our human genome. So we can't survive without them. So I just am always telling people, like, be mindful of loving and caring for your microbial self and really understanding how to do that, because we're not going to be around if we don't take care of our microbes.
Yeah. 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 Bottom line. Yeah. 100%. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. The last question that I want to ask you, what do you think is the most important thing you can do to live with purpose?
Oh, well, for me, the most important thing you can do to live with purpose is to listen to the voice within. And
Mm.
that is your relationship with God or the higher power. People have different names,
Mhm.
but I listen to the voice within, and that
Mhm.
has really guided me all this time in all the work that I've done building this to try to help John, and now to, for a bigger purpose,
Yeah.
even than that, to help people across the world.
Yeah, I love that. Listen to the voice within. That is such good advice, and it's perfect note to leave on. Thank you so much, Martha, for sharing this, and really for all your dedication to the research and everything that is behind the business that you've created. So thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Thanks for having me today.